I am not a gardener. Now, I make that statement not as a point of pride, but just a statement of fact. I grew up a city boy, suburbs. I've mowed a few lawns in my life. I've tossed some fertilizer around. The only picking of plants and vegetables I've ever done has been at the farmer's market. I must confess, I have a hard time keeping my houseplants alive. So I am not a gardener. Now, I know many of you, one of the things I've learned as I've moved here to Des Moines and gotten to know many of you, a lot of you grew up on farms and worked the land and created crops to feed your families, and I admire that immensely. But I have no context, no real understanding of what that entails. So it's interesting that the title of my sermon today is The Gardener. Because right up front, I must say I have very little knowledge about what that entails. But like I said last week, not knowing anything about a subject never prevents me from preaching about it. The second story of creation, which we read this morning, as I highlighted, is very different from the very first one we read last week. If you remember the language of dominion and subjugation over creation, this story is very different in how it characterizes the work of creation and our position, our humanity in the midst of it. In fact, it's rather clear. It says that God made humans and put the human, Adam, in the garden to work and till the garden. And like Hannah's wise words this morning, this idea of serving and protecting as the gardener. In other words, God created Adam to be a gardener. It's interesting to think about. Now, the second reading I did this morning, of course, is that story of the Gospel for John, that is the Easter morning. And what's interesting about this story is we're told Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and discovers two angels who ask her, "Why are you weeping?" And she says, "Where have they put the body of Jesus?" And then she kind of turns and she sees Jesus, but she doesn't recognize him. In fact, the Gospel of John, this really tiny line, says she mistakes him for a gardener. Now, truth be told, I've always thought of that as a really odd particular detail in that story. In fact, to be honest, I've kind of ignored it. I've always chalked it up to being something a little bit strange about the Gospel of John. Most scholars, most of the stories of Easter, people have trouble recognizing Jesus, and that's how I've often thought of that story, of that tiny detail, just an expression of our inability to recognize the risen Lord in our midst, that's a common challenge we have as followers. It's hard to see the risen Lord. Maybe it's because we don't expect to see. But I never really thought much about this tiny line in which she mistakes the risen Lord as a gardener. What an odd detail, if you think about it. Now, the picture up here, I don't know if you can see it very well, but in 1638, Rembrandt painted a picture of this story. And in it, the picture, if you can't really see it well, and if you can't, go ahead and Google this later, but it's really interesting. It has Mary Magdalene at the top of these stairs, right at the entrance of the tomb, the spice jar right in front of her, and right in the tomb, you see the two angels kind of kind of laying about, rather relaxed, I think. And there is Jesus, and you see her head turning as she looks at him. And what's interesting, Rembrandt paints Jesus, and what you would understand, he looks like a gardener in this story. You can't really see the detail. In one, he's holding a spade, he has a knife and other tools in his belt, he's wearing that right robe, and on top of his head, he has this floppy hat, as if it's someone working in the sun all day long. Now, I don't know much about gardening, but I know you're supposed to wear the floppy hat, right? That's required, right? So no wonder she mistook him for the gardener. He looked like a gardener. Now, there is a writer, an author, a pastor. His name is Brian Zahnd. He says, really, the story is not a misconception about her mistaking Jesus' identity as a gardener. In fact, he says that's the whole point. The resurrected Lord, he says, is the gardener who turns the blighted wasteland into something beautiful. That it was very intentional to use this image of the gardener. Jesus wasn't resurrected as a conductor who stamps our past to get into heaven. Jesus wasn't resurrected as a lawyer who gets us out of trouble with his angry dad. Jesus wasn't resurrected as a bank officer who loans us a surplus of God's righteousness. Zahnd argues that it's very intentional that the image of Jesus as gardener is an image of resurrection. That the resurrected Lord within our hearts and within our minds cultivates and works like a gardener in the soil of our souls to create resurrection. It's a rather beautiful image and a meaningful one, more so than I had really thought about. I may not be a gardener, but I can appreciate it. But I actually think, and as I prayed about this story and reflect on it, I wonder if part of the reason Mary confused Jesus being a gardener wasn't simply because he was dressed like one, but I wonder if he was actually doing gardening. Now, I know that's an odd thought. The resurrection has occurred. This amazing reality, death has been overcome. Resurrection has happened. Good succeeds rising out of death. In the response to this, the very risen Lord, I wondered, could it be that his first act was to do a little gardening? That's kind of odd to think about if you think about it. He's puttering around in the garden. And part of the reason I think that's an interesting idea or something to imagine is the truth be told that the work of a gardener, the work of caring for and tilling and serving and protecting creation is an act of resurrection. It isn't an afterthought that actually Jesus, the risen Lord, is at work. A resurrection work puttering around in the garden. And how often do we think of our garden work or the work in serving and protecting creation? How often do we think of that more than just stewardship of God's creation, but that it's a very act of resurrection? Now, maybe we shouldn't be that surprised by this idea, because we often think of resurrection only in terms of our souls, of human souls. But the truth is that the very story of creation connects human beings to the very earth we are created. I hadn't thought about this, but God used the humus, which is a dark organic material that makes the soil very dark, and God created humans. And so the truth is that we have this bond, this connection, this reality that we are connected to the earth. So it would not be surprising that when God raised Jesus, and when Jesus proclaimed resurrection and lived it, it was not only a resurrection of us, it is of this very earth that we are connected to. And that's good news to me. Because sometimes it feels a little hopeless in the midst of the world we live in today, the challenges of addressing climate change, the challenges of seeing our environment around us, and the harm we do. We do the opposite of serve and protect in a lot of ways. But the assertion here is that Jesus, the risen Lord, is puttering around in this world saving creation. The good news is not just up to us, but God is at work in creation. And the startling news is that we participate in that resurrection when we garden, when we work the soil, when we build and care for creation around us. We have a garden here at church. And I'm sure many of us think, and I know it wasn't because of me, that we had these gifts from these church members who were able to make that garden, able to create vegetables and beautiful flowers. And it's been a good thing that we can share that with each other. We can share the flowers, and we can take home some of the vegetables and even share them with other people. And that's a good thing in and of itself. We might think it's a small thing, but what if we realized that if we worked that garden, we're doing the work of resurrection? That it's a witness in and of itself to resurrection. That when you're out there in your own gardens, mowing your own yards with your floppy hats, you're doing resurrection. So I hope and invite you to live and breathe the resurrection by puttering around in the gardens of this world around us, and witness by your very act of care for this creation. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.